Good afternoon. Welcome to today's webinar hosted by the Legal Defense Fund and the National Fair Housing Alliance, marking the release of our joint report entitled The Bad Housing Blues, which examines housing discrimination at the intersection of race and economic inequality, and also shares results of a study regarding source of income discrimination in Memphis, Tennessee. This year marks the 55th anniversary of the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King, which occurred in Memphis. And it also marks the 55th anniversary of the passage of the Fair Housing Act, less than a week after the assassination of Dr. King. My name is Lisa Cylar Barrett. I am the Director of Policy and the Director of the Washington, D.C. office for the Legal Defense Fund. And I'm thrilled to serve as your moderator for the webinar today. We note that this year also marks the 55th anniversary of the Kerner Commission report, which notably concluded that the nation was moving toward two societies, one Black, one white, separate and unequal. Addressing the problems of racial justice in this country requires that we address economic inequity. And central to economic inequity is discrimination in housing. So we are eager to have this conversation, particularly today, the day after the Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. holiday, as we honor Dr. King's legacy of fighting against inequality, and as we set forth the work that remains to ensure equitable access to safe and affordable housing in communities of opportunity. We are thrilled to have a broad spectrum of folks joining us for this webinar today. We're joined by representatives of national civil rights organizations, local and community partners from cities across the country, including Memphis, local fair housing centers from across the country, federal agency officials in Washington, D.C., housing industry partners, and more. And I'm so excited to have this conversation. Addressing issues of housing discrimination is a personal passion. My parents, when I was growing up, served as housing testers. And so I grew up in a household hearing about these issues and am just honored to work side by side with partners like our panelists today. We have a wonderful group of panelists, so let me just introduce you to them quickly. Julián Castro is the former HUD secretary, and he is a senior research fellow at the Legal Defense Fund's Thurgood Marshall Institute. Secretary Castro served as the U.S. Secretary of Housing and Urban Development under President Barack Obama from 2014 to 2017, and was previously the mayor of his native San Antonio, Texas. In 2021, Secretary Castro became an MSNBC News political analyst, and he currently serves as a visiting professor of practice at Harvard Law School. Lisa Rice is the president and CEO of the National Fair Housing Alliance. And as president and CEO, she directs NFHA's mission to eliminate all forms of housing discrimination and ensure equitable housing opportunities for all people and communities. NFHA leads the fair housing movement and is the trade association for over 200 member organizations throughout the country. Lisa Rice is a published author contributing to several books and journals addressing a range of fair housing issues, including the fight for fair housing, causes, consequences, and future implications of the 1968 Federal Fair Housing Act. She is one of the nation's leading experts on fair housing and lending policies, having played major roles in crafting sections of the Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform and Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. So we are thrilled to have Lisa join us and to partner with NFHA on this important report and webinar today. We also have Roshun Austin, who is the president and CEO of The Works, Inc., a 24-year-old community development corporation in Memphis. The Works is the developer of single-family and multifamily properties in distressed neighborhoods. It operates a farmer's market and a green grocer, provides nutrition education, operates a mortgage loan fund, and does work around the comprehensive needs of children and families. The works merged with Neighborhood Preservation, Inc. in January 2022, expanding its services to include policy advocacy, the Strategic Code Enforcement Management Academy, the Blight Elimination Steering Team, and promoting collaborative efforts to develop practical and sustainable resolutions to blighted properties and the systems that lead to widespread neglect, vacancy, and abandonment. And last, but certainly not least, we have Morgan Williams, my partner in crime. He's the general counsel at the National Fair Housing Alliance. Morgan is responsible for leading NFHA's strategic and tactical legal initiatives and affairs. He directs NFHA's efforts to pursue pioneering litigation under the Federal Fair Housing Act. And he's often utilizing testing-based evidence and working in partnership with NFHA's network of local fair housing centers, and coordinates NFHA's actions in filing amicus briefs to promote sound fair housing jurisprudence. Previously, Morgan served as the general counsel at the Greater New Orleans Fair Housing Action Center, so many of you may know him from his work there. And we are just thrilled to have this panel of experts and passionate advocates as we enter this conversation today. In terms of our format for the webinar, we will hear some initial opening remarks from each of our panelists, and then we'll move into more of a discussion format where we'll have some Q&A. If you have questions that you would like to pose to the panelists, please use the Q&A function, and we will be able to communicate those questions to the panelists through that function. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Secretary Castro to provide his initial remarks. Secretary Castro.
Thank you so much, Lisa. And, it's been my pleasure to serve as a senior research fellow with the NAACP's Legal Defense Fund Thurgood Marshall Institute. And this is just one more example of the fantastic work that they do. I also, of course, want to thank Lisa and everybody at NFHA for the fantastic, just excellent analysis that they provide in the fair housing space. And also thank Roshun for being a part of this and commend the great work that she does on a daily basis, providing housing opportunity. Yesterday, as Lisa mentioned, we commemorated the life and the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and the vision that he had, and so many others have shared and worked for through the generations, to ensure that we could become a country where everyone is able to reach their dreams and to prosper. An important component of that is housing affordability and availability. For several years, though, we have had a housing affordability crisis, which is important to the backdrop of this report. The National Low-Income Housing Coalition, for instance, recently noted that there wasn't a single county where somebody working minimum wage full-time could afford the rent on a 2-bedroom apartment. And only in 7% of counties could they afford the rent on a 1-bedroom apartment. At the same time, over the last several decades, the nation's commitment to investing in public housing and other types of housing availability have not kept up with the need. And that need is greatest for the lowest income Americans, often the types of folks who are served by the Housing Choice Voucher program. That's why today's report is so meaningful and is a reminder of the urgency, really serves as a call to action that we need to invest in greater housing opportunity for all Americans. And we also have to keep our eyes open and be aware that just because this is not 1968 doesn't mean that racial injustice doesn't still exist in very real ways, as this report makes clear. This report is important because it shines light on the types of disadvantages that Housing Choice Voucher program recipients often encounter in the housing market, that they are discriminated against, and this shows this in a scientific and thorough way. And not only are they discriminated against, but also oftentimes their race, whether they're Black or white or brown, matters as well. And so it's the most vulnerable Americans that often have the toughest time finding safe, decent, affordable housing. This is a call to action because the only way that we can change this is by making the investments that we should in greater housing opportunity, and also by funding fair housing efforts in Memphis and Shelby County and throughout the United States. Because the truth is that this is not just a challenge for Shelby County. This is a challenge for counties all throughout this country. It's also true that today, housing authorities and other housing providers are under a lot of strain. The truth is that we've underfunded these efforts for decades. It means that that has to end. In fiscal year budgets to come, we need to ensure that we're funding housing opportunity at appropriate levels, that we're doing so with policies and investments that also put fair housing efforts right at the very top of the priority list. I was very happy to see that the report includes recommendations that policymakers can put into place to ensure that the kind of source of income discrimination that's highlighted here and racial discrimination is put to an end, and that greater housing opportunity is available for every single American out there. You know, Dr. King, toward the end especially of his life, focused a lot on fair housing efforts. And so it's fitting that today this report does the same. It focuses on the very real need to address fair housing justice and housing opportunity in general, and change our laws to protect housing choice voucher recipients so that they can find meaningful opportunity out there like anybody else. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Secretary Castro, providing that important context around the importance of housing choice vouchers. We're going to move to Lisa Rice to provide some initial remarks.
Thank you so much, Lisa. Cylar Barrett. And I really would be remiss if I did not start out by thanking our sister in arms, LDF, for its great leadership on this important issue. I must, of course, also extend my appreciation, deep appreciation to Secretary Castro for his leadership, both during his tenure at HUD and now for his diligent work on ensuring that people who are struggling to pay their rent each month are able to remain stably housed. And of course, to my colleague, Roshun Austin, who is just a star. She's a trailblazer on housing equity issues for her groundbreaking work that is providing affordable and fair housing opportunities to thousands of people, both in Memphis and throughout the nation. Her work really is pioneering and copied by many community development and housing development organizations throughout the nation. And of course, my colleague, my dear colleague, Morgan Williams, who is one of the nation's leading legal experts on fair housing issues. Lisa, you know, at the top, you acknowledged the 55th anniversary of the Fair Housing Act, which of course was passed just 7 days after Dr. King's horrific assassination. It is somewhat serendipitous that we are talking about an investigation in Memphis, which is the place where Dr. King was assassinated. It's sad to say, but it is true. It's a sad commentary that without Dr. King's assassination, we would not have the Fair Housing Act. This event today is the second event in a series of events that NFHA is co-hosting with our civil rights partners. It's really commemorative and reflective programs that we're putting together to highlight the 55th year anniversary of those two milestone events in our history. So it's fitting that this event is being held and done in partnership with LDF. Both of our organizations, NFHA and LDF, co-chair the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights Fair Housing Task Force. So LDF and NFHA have worked closely together for decades addressing bias against housing choice voucher holders. Several years ago, we decided to really take the plunge, the deep plunge, and do something major to address this discrimination, which was not dissipating throughout the country. So we decided to conduct a comprehensive investigation centered in the Memphis market to address discrimination, the nature and extent of bias against housing choice voucher holders. The Bad Housing Blues report not only provides a detailed explanation of the housing choice voucher program and other forms of housing assistance that we've provided to Americans over the decades, but the report also details the investigation that we undertook in the Memphis region and our investigatory findings, which are really quite troubling. The housing choice voucher program is just one of the ways that taxpayers support access to housing opportunity in this nation. If you hold a mortgage loan, if you have running water, electricity, or gas in your housing unit, if you were not evicted during the COVID pandemic, when you could not pay your mortgage or your rental housing payment, you have benefited from taxpayer supports. We as taxpayers have long supported, since the nascency of this country, since the genesis of this country, we have supported housing for people in this nation. Via the Housing Choice Voucher Program, people who struggle paying their rent can get help with rental payment subsidies. The investigation that we conducted revealed clearly, however, that when it comes to this particular form of taxpayer assistance, we as a country are really dropping the ball. For decades, people's incomes, as Secretary Castro noted, have not matched with the increases in rental housing prices. That means that more and more people need help via the Housing Choice Voucher Program. But discrimination against those who access this program, if our investigation is any measure, is really rampant. We conducted matched pair testing, matching one Black tester with one white tester. Both testers had substantially similar, the same financial profiles. The testers visited the same housing provider within a very short period of time, and we recorded and then analyzed their experiences. Our audit sought to determine at the pre-application stage of the rental process whether potential tenants with housing choice vouchers were subject to discrimination because of their status as a voucher holder. And what we found was that in the city of Memphis, there was a 75% rate of discrimination against both white and Black voucher holders. In Shelby County, there was a 93.8% rate of discrimination. Overall, there was an 84.4% rate of discrimination. When we isolated for race only, we also found differences based on whether or not the testers were white or Black. That is, housing providers were much more willing to rent to white voucher holders than Black voucher holders. Our investigation found that 37.5% of the tests showed evidence of discrimination against Black voucher holders. The report does detail the various ways in which housing providers perpetuated discrimination against voucher holders. This level of discrimination really cannot be allowed to continue. Discrimination against voucher holders leads to housing instability and homelessness. It contributes to poor education and health outcomes for children, and it really does not represent who we are as a nation. So it's imperative that we implement solutions that we've lifted up in the report to stop this form of discrimination. Thank you, Lisa.
Thank you, Lisa. It's wonderful to have that broad overview of what's contained in the report. We encourage you, if you have not read the report, to make sure you download it. It's a wealth of information. And as Lisa shared, it also contains a set of recommendations. So now I want to turn to Roshun Austin to give us some remarks and a sense of the impacts of source of income discrimination in Memphis, where she does tremendous work. So, Roshun.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Lisa. I have to first say that I am kind of starstruck to be on this panel. I nerd out over people who are in the housing world, of particularly affordable housing, and I'm pleased to serve on a panel with Secretary Castro and my friend Lisa Rice at NFHA and Morgan, and also Lisa Cylar Barrett. Roshun Austin, president of the Works, a community development corporation, and I really need to change my bio because now we're 25 years old in the housing work, but 30 years old as a organization working in Memphis neighborhoods that have experienced disinvestment. And today, I guess it's appropriate, and I didn't even think about it, but 55 years ago yesterday, Dr. King was assassinated about 2 miles from where I sit today. And I sit on a street named after the father of my development partner, A.W. Willis, one of the civil rights attorneys that brought Dr. King here to Memphis during the sanitation workers' strike. And I'm sitting in front of a photo taken by a local photographer of the sanitation strike, the conditions that people were experiencing in the winter of 1968 here in Memphis. And I didn't think about this until people were mentioning that I was actually sitting in front of this photo. After reading the report, and I'm going to age myself, so I was born 3 years after that assassination here in Memphis, in a neighborhood that experienced a lot of disinvestment, living in less than quality housing, and I was probably better off than many of my neighbors. And I tend to refer to people around me as my neighbors because I liken my work into a ministry. And so I love my neighbors as myself, and I would like for them to have similar experiences to me and my family. But when I was after reading the report, and this also ages me, I started thinking about something from a movie, The Truman Show. And very often, I think during the pandemic, and now when we do investigations, not until those things happen do people actually really get a good look at things. And so for younger people, The Truman Show in 1998 was about a young man who did not know his entire life was filmed. And once he started to discover that, Truman was forced to make a decision about this truth that he was discovering. He needed to decide whether he needed to act on this. And so this panel today and the recommendations that come out of the report, we need to decide as a city, a municipality, a nation on how we act on the continued discrimination in housing for our most vulnerable citizens in our city and in our nation. I also like to, because everybody's not in this work every day, and so they don't know, housing choice vouchers. They don't know what that means, who gets a housing choice voucher. So I tend to provide a lot of definition when I'm talking on panels. And so just for understanding, people who receive housing choice vouchers or families that receive housing choice vouchers, 75% of those families have incomes that do not exceed 30% of the area's median income. So what does that look like in Memphis? That means that for a family of four at 30%, and at the top of that, that's $23,000 a year. That's $1,900 per month. That's, if they are full-time, that's $11 an hour, and that's $62 per day. The other 25% of the families in the Public Housing Authority's Housing Choice Voucher program can be at 50%, but that's not much better. For a family of four, that means $38,400, $3,200 a month, $18 an hour, and assume there may be 2 adults in the household, and $103 a day. And so if we start breaking that down, I just think about 1 cup of coffee at Starbucks. I may spend $10 a day, and I'm just one person. And so we're talking about a family of 4 with those incomes. Of course, it's based on family size, but think it's less for a family of 1, 2, or 3. And that means that a family of 4 at 30% if we're spending only 30% of our income, our gross income toward housing expense, that's $576 per month. And for a family of four at the 50% range, it's $960. I don't know what decade others live in, but I live in 2023. And so it's not often that you're able to find rents, and assuming that they have multiple genders in the house, they may need a 3-bedroom for $576 or a 3-bedroom at $960. That doesn't exist very often. I can't say that it doesn't exist at all because we have pretty low rents, but we probably don't have one at 3-bedroom at $576. But this study is very important to me in our work because we are the developers of and landlords of housing for our neighbors here in Memphis. And I also wanted to mention something specific to Memphis, that about a quarter of the residents in Memphis live at or below poverty. That means their incomes are in this 30 and 50% range. That means that's about 150,000, between 150 and 160,000 of our neighbors in Memphis have incomes this low. And that's not including, I started calculating the cost of fuel. What's the average cost of fuel they have to eat? What does it cost them to eat? But it's mutually beneficial. And I always talk to both government and the private sector and the nonprofit sector. What is the mutual benefit for all of our neighbors to have quality of life, whether it's around their housing, their food, how they access spaces? And so that's important in our work. And I don't want to have comments that go on long because there'll be time for questions. But I just want us to look at how we address the issues that were discovered, not necessarily discovered, were rediscovered in this report because they've been happening for decades. Before King came to Memphis, he talked about in both a 66 and a 67 address in Chicago and Michigan, respectively, about the, and we usually say inhumane, but he talked about our access to healthcare and housing as inhuman. And so that's something slightly different than we talk about when we talk about inhumane. And so I want us to not just talk about these numbers and talk about this discrimination, but as Truman had to do in that 1998 movie, I want us to figure out how that we act on these discoveries to help our neighbors have better quality of life.
Thank you so much, Roshun. It was really helpful and grounding to hear sort of what does this actually look like on the ground, and what does this look like for families in Memphis. So I do want to just take us back. So for those of you who have read the report, you know that it begins with sort of this historical context, right, of laying out the history regarding public housing and the implementation of the Housing Choice Voucher program. And within that context, really highlights the role of racist government policies in creating and exacerbating discrimination and segregation across the country, but in Memphis specifically, from the exclusion of Black families from the originally established public housing, which was originally designed to address the shortage, the housing shortage for working class and lower middle class families, to then moving to separate public housing complexes for Black and white families, to the refusal of the Federal Housing Administration and the Veterans Administration to ensure loans to Black people, et cetera. And I think I saw that Richard Rothstein, who is the noted author of the seminal book, The Color of Law. If you haven't read it, make sure you order it on Amazon or pick it up tonight from your local bookstore. And also has been a senior fellow at LDF, examines all of these policies and the role that government has actually played in sort of where we are today. But I'd love for each of you to just take a moment to talk about some of these policies and the impact and the ramifications that we're still seeing decades later. And I will start with Secretary Castro.
Thank you, Lisa. And you're talking about policies that have sort of gotten us into the situation that we're in now. I assume the negative policies or harmful policies.
Absolutely, absolutely. And eventually we're going to move to a conversation on solutions. But if we had government policies that really got us in this place, then we got to examine policies to get us out. But I want to start with this history.
Wow, and there's so many of them. I mean, I was reminded every day when I was HUD secretary of how much we were trying to right the wrongs of the past, beginning with policies like redlining and the fact that when the FHA was created in 1934, it was part of the problem in refusing to insure, refusing to insure mortgages to homes for Black Americans, basically sanctioning the action of lenders who would not lend, not extend credit to Black Americans, to local ordinances in places all over the country that segregated neighborhoods. Just up the road in Austin, a great example of a city council that in the first half of the 20th century passed a law that essentially cordoned off the Black community. To more recent issues, but still very, very harmful, like displacement and gentrification that have drawn out or have skyrocketed rents in traditionally neglected and Black and brown communities throughout the country, and have displaced many people, especially in urban America. You add to that the neglect in funding of public housing, of the Housing Choice Voucher Program, the underfunding of fair housing efforts within HUD and of nonprofits throughout the country. I recall, for instance, when I was HUD secretary, that there had been a report by the Bipartisan Policy Center on Housing, and among other things, it found that we needed to add, it recommended that we add several hundred staff members to our fair housing office. And we continue to be far, far behind from doing that. So you can draw a straight line from the terrible discriminatory Jim Crow laws to the practices and policies of the federal government, to local racist governments, to racism in the private sector, in lending and so forth, to the challenges that we face today. And then the larger challenges of affordability in general that have created the urgency that we see and that really is uncovered in this report.
Thank you so much, Secretary. Lisa, Roshun, anything you want to add there?
Yeah, I just want to add one point to kind of just emphasize that history that Secretary Castro provided. And that is that before the inception of this nation, right, during the colonial period in what we now call the United States of America, we have always had governments, even the European colonial governments, that used taxpayer dollars to support land and home ownership, the head rights efforts, the head rights programs, the land grant program, the homestead program, and so forth and so on. In this nation, we have literally passed hundreds of laws. And if you add policies onto that, it's in the thousands of laws and policies that we've implemented to provide housing and home ownership and land ownership opportunities for people that were all race-based, that used race consciousness in the laws, either explicitly or in the policies that were used to implement those laws. Secretary Castro mentioned the Federal Housing Administration program, which encouraged the use of racially restrictive covenants, which encouraged segregation. The Homeowners Loan Corporation that was implemented during the Depression, that program established our modern day appraisal system, which is deeply biased because that appraisal, that race valuation construct was developed using an expressed association between race and risk. And all of those elements, all of those laws and policies created the structural barriers that still are in place today. They created things like residential segregation. They created things like restrictive zoning ordinances, again, that are still in place today. The dual credit market is still in place today, and these unfair structural systems are still driving racial inequality.
Yeah, and I agree. Secretary Castro and Lisa talked about the national policies and laws, but if we bring that home to Memphis, and so we look at the redlining map for Memphis, which was included in the report, I just did an experiment on my own, and I took the interstate maps that happened after that, and I lay them on, I overlay them, and they're almost identical. Then our local government, over decades, did not reinvest in the infrastructure in these neighborhoods that were either torn or split in half in some instances by the interstate, and no lending around because of the redlining maps and appraisals in those neighborhoods. They look identical today. And as a developer of affordable housing, although we benefit from the mid-'80s and the establishment of the low-income housing tax credit program in 1986 through our state housing finance agency, if we look at our qualified allocation plan from year to year, it still discriminates on us building housing because of exclusionary zoning in areas that are high opportunity, as mentioned in the report. And so on one side, that's the developer. We can't build in high opportunity areas because of NIMBYism, and sometimes it's local policy with zoning, but sometimes it's the neighbors who don't want the others to move there. Also, a lack of investment on the part of our local government, both at the state and municipal level, in infrastructure improvements so that we can come in and build affordable housing, which is already upside down because of the amount of subsidy we have to leave in those deals in order to maintain affordability for the end users. And so I just started thinking about how the federal policy and laws have played at a local level. And after 1968, you saw flight from the city of Memphis. And so our city expanded from a normal size city. I say we turned into a huge suburb of over 300 square miles. And our investment of our county commission and our city council moved along the corridors toward white flight and wealth, and they abandoned neighborhoods that had long been disinvested. And so those same areas for the last 55 years have not seen investment on the part of our local, state, or federal government.
Thank you so much, Roshun. You went right where I was going to go. So that's great. And really looking at how these programs at the local level that really, at least theoretically, were designed to help Black communities, but in reality, the way that they were implemented oftentimes worked to the detriment of our communities. And that's not just in Memphis, but across the country. So I want to go back for a moment to the importance of housing choice vouchers, both as a link to community resources or as a link to community resources in various forms, but also as a way of addressing the racial wealth gap and that exists and persists today. And just would ask each of you to really talk about that function of housing choice vouchers in relation to those two things. And Lisa, maybe I'll kick it off with you.
Thanks, Lisa. Of course, I think that Roshun did a great job of laying out why we need the housing choice voucher program. But it's difficult to kind of connect that thread and weave it to all of the sort of different things that impact our lives, like our ability to access a living wage job, the ability of our children to access great educations in areas where there are well-resourced schools, and even making sure that there are well-resourced schools in every community. So the housing choice voucher is really an opportunity to give people that chance to get a leg up, right? To set down roots so that they can go to school, so that they can have a place where they can be gainfully employed, and so that they don't have to spend all of their income, right, on housing, and they can meet the other needs of their families and households. So this program is so really important to give people that foundation. And of course, we don't have, the need is much greater, right? We have tried to increase support for the Housing Choice Voucher program so that it can be adequately funded. And here is where I'm going to make a pitch to all of those in the audience to really help us in this regard. We tried to get adequate funding in both the Infrastructure Act and the Inflation Reduction Act, but we just didn't have enough support at the ground level to include the funding levels that we needed in those two major bills. And so the Housing Choice Voucher program remains unfunded. But again, it's so important for people to have that foundation, that housing stability, because we know that children who are in stable housing have much better health outcomes, they have higher educational outcomes, and then people who are in, adults who are in stable housing have higher outcomes in terms of voting and civic engagement and other kinds of areas. This program is critically important.
Great, thank you, Lisa. Roshun, Secretary Castro, anything you want to add on this issue of sort of the way that Housing Choice Vouchers connects to other resources and also helps us address the racial wealth gap?
No, I think Lisa said it very well and comprehensively. I mean, I would just also emphasize that really how foundational this housing is for people who otherwise likely would be doubling up, some of whom would find themselves unsheltered, sometimes sheltered in temporary housing, scrambling to find a place to live, especially as rents have risen, skyrocketed in many local markets. And so this really provides a strong foundation. It also allows for better health outcomes, better educational outcomes, and better economic outcomes across the board. In that very real sense, it helps to close that racial wealth gap. And especially when you add in as well, a lot of the supportive services that sometimes go with these housing choice vouchers, or at least access to them, that helps even more. So altogether, this is a very positive program, a positive force for closing that gap.
Yeah, it's incumbent on us as humans. And as we establish civilizations, our first act, we talk about cavemen, well, they sheltered. And so how we shelter is the center of the quality of our lives, because if we're left in the wild, we're open to the elements or those that would prey upon us. And so housing is our largest outlay of cash for most families. I won't say the top 1%, but for most of us, it's the largest outlay of cash each month. And it is the center of the quality, and where our housing is located is also important in terms of how we access the things that Lisa mentioned of education, jobs, careers, food, because our organization is involved in the food space, also in accessing grocery and healthy food. And I don't really like to talk about this, but I often talk about one of the zip codes where one of our low-income housing tax credit properties is located in Memphis in Shelby County, 38106. It has the lowest life expectancy in Shelby County. And much of it is driven by our inability to access healthy food. It's in the difference, it's startling. It's 13 years. If you go 13 miles east, each mile you gain a year of life. So from Memphis to Collierville, one of our very high opportunity areas, one of our suburban communities, it's the Lifetime Fitness model. And I always say that as a corporation, they have a model, 2.5 kids, probably 250,000 in income, education, they have master's degrees. And that model, and I can go to any city, whether it's Houston, Austin, Dallas, Atlanta, New York, wherever they're located, that model of where Lifetime sits looks the same. And so the housing choice voucher, similar to public housing when it was established in the early 20th century, was meant to give a leg up. Of course, there was a lot of discrimination, particularly in the South. And so it ended up giving a leg up to veterans returning, white veterans returning from the world wars, before we started to establish segregated housing for Blacks and African Americans and others, Black and brown people in cities. And so this program is critically important, as all investment into housing for a quarter of the citizens in Memphis is important for the quality of life for their families, but also for the quality of life for all of us, because we're so interdependent upon one another.
Thank you so much, Roshun. I want to stay with you because I want to ask a Memphis question. But to your point, this is an issue in cities across the country, and so we'll extrapolate from there. We're getting just wonderful questions in the Q&A, and so please continue to put your questions there. We'll pivot to those questions in just a moment. But Roshun, can you share, give us an idea of the magnitude of the problem in Memphis, right? What is the current need for affordable housing in Memphis in areas that would provide the type of opportunity that you were just talking about in terms of access to quality schools and access to healthy foods and a livable wage and all of those things? What does that look like in Memphis, the need?
So as of a 2019 report by the Urban Institute, Memphis at that time needed 38,000 affordable units for families. Our organization a few years ago, along with the organization we merged with, Neighborhood Preservation Inc., completed a documentary called In the Absence. It was particularly around blight and code enforcement issues. But there's one point in the documentary where I say, if we enforce the code, that we seriously enforce the code, that Memphis would have the largest unhoused population in the United States, because we're already down 38,000. A quarter of our citizens live at or below poverty. And unfortunately, they're secondhand chance properties that don't have the best living conditions where people live. So they're affordable, but they are not the best quality. So if we shut those down, and we're already down 38, and that was in 2019. I think during the pandemic, as I mentioned during my Truman Show reference, we across the nation, we saw during the pandemic living conditions. So teachers didn't have an opportunity to peer into the homes of the children they were educating, but they did during that pandemic because they were online. And so they saw some of the living conditions with families, 12 people in a 1 bedroom or a 2 bedroom, because they didn't have anywhere else to live. And so, then later on, I did a mini documentary with the Guardian newspaper. They told me something I didn't know. They had to come from London to tell me that Memphis was the hunger capital of the US. And so you think about this dearth of affordable housing, a high poverty rate, and then we don't have access to the most basic needs throughout our community. And so we don't have the groceries that should sustain us as human beings in these neighborhoods. And so I could go on there. I don't want to make Memphis sound like it's the worst place in the world, because it's my home and it's a city that I love, and I will continue to advocate to make it a better place. But there are some serious issues that we need to address, and it looks similar to sister cities across the United States.
Thank you, Roshun. And to that point, Lisa, Secretary Castro, this isn't specific or unique to Memphis. And so can you just share, from your sort of national view, what we're seeing in cities across the country and in terms of this issue of really the need for affordable housing and that housing be in places where families, individuals are able to to access the opportunities that they need to thrive and do well.
Sure, I can kick that off real quickly. I hail from Toledo, Ohio, which is just a stone's throw from Motown, Detroit, Michigan. And when I was living in Toledo, Roshun, doing a lot of work in Detroit for over 30 years, the entire city of Detroit, a population of almost 700,000 people, did not have one single grocery store. This is not, the challenges Memphis is facing is not new. We are seeing these challenges in large urban areas, in rural areas, in the colonias. It is really horrific in the colonias. On our native lands, the housing challenges are stark, and they are a result of a disproportionate investment in infrastructure and housing throughout our nation. As I mentioned, we have always supported housing. There's never been a time in the United States when we have not supported home and land ownership and housing. Never been a time in the country. We make it seem like people who live in well-resourced communities because they somehow pulled themselves up by their bootstraps. Not true. They were given boots that had straps. And that's why they were able to pull them up. But too many communities, like the one that Roshun just named, were never given boots. So how do you pull yourself up by your bootstraps? And those communities, I mean, we all know the stories of Native communities, of Latino communities, of Black communities who created their own shoes only to have someone come and steal them from them. So the resources have not been fair. The support of the government has not been fair. And that is why it's so critical that we advance on these fair housing principles, enforce our civil rights, the full bevy of our civil rights laws, so that everyone has equitable opportunity.
Yeah, very, very well said. As HUD Secretary, I traveled to about 100 different communities and saw the whole range of housing opportunity challenges on Native American reservations and, of course, our urban centers, and also more and more in places that traditionally didn't think they had a problem. I mean, just go out to the Los Angeles area and people will tell you that you don't only see homelessness on Skid Row, but also in underpasses and communities going out to the suburbs. And you also see people who oftentimes we think would be doing fine that are having a housing challenge. I remember being in Oakland and hearing about a middle school teacher that her colleague said was sleeping in her truck because she couldn't afford a place to live in a place that had seen skyrocketing rents over the last few years. It is definitely a challenge for a cross section of Americans, and even steeper challenge for Black, brown, and people of color in this country. And we have not kept up in the United States with the investments we need to make to provide more housing opportunity. I mean, it's been as simple as that at the federal level, the state level, or the local level. And as a former mayor and councilman, I can also say that local land use and planning and the NIMBYism that too often exists, especially when you're dealing with disadvantaged, vulnerable communities, inhibits the ability to put housing that is affordable in areas of opportunity. So you layer that over with the challenge that this report shows of even when there might be some of that housing in an area and a voucher holder goes and tries to get that opportunity, that it's not there because of discrimination. And so you get this picture that the entire system is still too often stacked against these vulnerable individuals and families.
Thank you. Thank you. That's so helpful to have the picture. And as Roshun said, it's a city that she loves, and all of us who come from cities that are experiencing, which is basically every urban area experiencing this challenge, also love the places that we we come from, right? And so we're just trying to make them better, but we want to make sure that we used Memphis as a study, but it's not a Memphis problem. It is a national problem. So we have questions coming in that really signal that people are thinking about how they start to address this and how they jump in and roll their sleeves up. So I want to pose some of these questions to you all. So one question is, how do fair housing advocates do testing investigations for source of income discrimination or other forms of discrimination where an application form is required to be submitted before an applicant can be considered? Do you all have recommendations?
Sure, I can, as I guess the testing organization on the panel, I can take that. So I can't go into all of the details. I mean, we would be here literally all day for us to discuss proper testing strategies. But the general gist of it is that we find testers. Lisa mentioned at the top of the hour that her parents were testers. And we know that things have changed over the years. A lot of housing providers require people to submit an application. So we do that. That requires fair housing organizations to have to do a ton of work in order to identify testers who would be willing to go through the application process. But there are methodologies that we can use to tease out practices and procedures that would have a discriminatory impact against people who are protected by our civil rights laws. And if you read this report, you'll see some of those examples and the results of that, where we were able to get testers in the pre-application phase to identify discriminatory policies and practices. But having said that, there are some housing providers who, for example, require you, before they'll even give you an answer about anything, require you to submit an application or to provide relevant information about yourself, your driver's license, etc., before they even give you information. And we do have strategies to address that. Having said that, we are just on the precipice. NFHA is in filing a case. Later today, we will be filing an HUD administrative complaint against a housing provider who operates in Memphis. This housing provider operates in 13 states, but we investigated them in the Memphis market and found discrimination against housing choice voucher holders in a way that discriminates and we believe violates the Fair Housing Act. So stay tuned and you'll see a press release about that later today.
Great, thank you, Lisa. We had another question. What evidence do fair housing advocates use in pursuing housing discrimination enforcement, dealing with source of income and other kinds of discrimination?
Well, I can kick that off and then turn it over to Secretary Castro. But we, because the Fair Housing Act, the Federal Fair Housing Act, does not explicitly mention source of income as a protected class, what we have to essentially do is look at who in a community is using housing choice vouchers and determine if the restriction against the use of housing choice vouchers is having what we call a discriminatory effect or a disparate impact on a group that is protected under the Fair Housing Act. And in this particular case that we're going to be bringing, we found a discriminatory impact on African Americans and Latinos in Memphis and are filing on those two protected classes. Now, there are some cases where municipalities will have source of income protection in their local fair housing ordinance. Memphis is one such city. But unfortunately, sometimes at the state level, and the state of Texas did this, the state of Texas will pass a law that prohibits local cities and jurisdictions from including source of income as a protected class.
And, I would just add, of course, how important the testing evidence is, the witnesses that are associated with that participate, and also the historical track record of different housing providers. And because the fair housing space, of course, is broad, oftentimes you're dealing with evidence of motivation for exclusionary policies in terms of land use, zoning, and planning. And, all of us can go through examples over the years of different cities and counties that have put exclusionary zoning into place or other land use practices that have made it practically impossible to locate affordable housing in certain neighborhoods. The question I know was about evidence. So that just implicates a whole range of evidence about the policymakers and their motivations, as well as the disparate impact that would have on different protected classes, including racial and ethnic minorities.
Great, thank you. Let's see, I'm trying to make sure I get a sampling of each of the questions. So here's a question. How does the lack of available, safe, and affordable rental housing restrict the ability to use a voucher and ultimately housing choice in the voucher program, both in Memphis and across the country? So the question is asking how much of this is a supply issue? And I'll let you all answer that. So maybe we'll start with Roshun on.
Yeah, I was hoping that we made that connection. And so, yeah, it's both and so I'd say we were down 38,000 units according to that 2019 study by the Urban Institute. Of course, that number we think has grown because many of the naturally occurring affordable units, because of code enforcement issues, have gone offline. A few years ago, we placed in service another tax credit property where we did a renovation, and it was about 18 million using the low-income housing tax credit and a lot of subsidy and debt. But it was only 146 units. So just think about it not really making a dent if we were already down 38,000 units. And so we do have this huge gap. So even if voucher holders have a voucher and they want quality affordable housing, we're not always able to do that. We have another 79 units that will probably come online next year, but we're in a position now, even in our scattered sites, single family development, we just never have an available open. The moment we are getting a certificate of occupancy, someone is moving in. And so there are no units from us, and we're one of the few nonprofit multifamily developers for affordable rental. There are other nonprofits or CDCs in Memphis, but mostly focused on single family detached for home ownership. And so, of course, that's a whole nother issue, but rental housing that's quality is just not available. And then we sit at the corner of two other states, Mississippi and Arkansas. They're, more rural states around us, but they're a part of our metropolitan area. But I'm sure they're suffering with the same issue because Memphians and Mississippians and Arkansans are in need of housing as well. And there's just not enough units of affordable housing.
Thank you, Roshun. Lisa, Secretary Castro, anything more on that? Okay, so I just quickly want to name some of the solutions or strategies that were included in the report. So we talked about, prohibiting discrimination against housing choice voucher families by amending the Fair Housing Act to include source of income as a protected class. We talked about expanding the small area fair market rule. We talked about expanding the housing choice voucher program itself. We talked about GSE financed multifamily housing, being required to promote voucher use, and improving the services offered through public housing authority agencies. And so we have a couple questions about, in addition to sort of making these recommendations to policymakers, what can people on this webinar who are not policymakers, in addition, what can they do? Aside from pushing on their policymakers at the federal, state, and local level, what can they do? And I'll also include a specific question that says, what can grassroots organizers and activists do to assist in this process? I'm a building tenant union in an apartment complex that is being forced to evict all of its tenants. Let's see, and most residents are expecting to receive vouchers as part of relocation. What can we do to protect ourselves going forward? And they're mentioning gross negligence and building code violations. So any suggestions for answering that specific question, but also the broader question of what individuals can do?
Yeah, I can kick it off. And I'm gonna, at this point, Lisa, sound like a broken record because it seems like every event I do, I am talking about the affirmatively furthering fair housing provision of the Federal Fair Housing Act. So let me explain to people what that means. The Fair Housing Act has a dual purpose. So on one side of the law, the Fair Housing Act says, if you're a housing provider, you can't discriminate against people based on their race or national origin or their gender, right? But there's another part of the law that was just brilliantly included by the authors, Ed Brooke and Walter Mondale, because they recognize the things that we've been talking about, that over centuries of unfair, unjust policies, we've created communities and landscapes that are deeply inequitable. So the affirmatively furthering fair housing provision says if you receive any federal funds, you have to now administer every single one of your housing programs and your programs for community development in a way that affirmatively furthers fair housing. And what that means is it has to be implemented in a way that provides equitable housing opportunities and housing related resources for everyone. You have to administer those funds in a way that ensures that every neighborhood is healthy, viable, and well-resourced and free from discrimination. It requires municipalities and public housing authorities to every 5 years write a fair housing plan. And in that it's basically a housing equity plan. So jurisdictions and public housing authorities have to identify fair housing barriers, and then they have to identify solutions to overcome them. And the great thing that I love about the AFFH process, the affirmatively furthering fair housing process that Secretary Castro included when he was able to promulgate the 2015 rule, and that hopefully we will see the Biden administration reinstate, is a requirement for community engagement. This is extremely important. Every single person in a community has the right, has the obligation, the opportunity to participate in this fair housing planning process and lift up these kinds of issues that we're talking about and solutions and strategies for overcoming fair housing barriers. And that includes the use of local resources, local city funds, county funds, and state funds. It's so important that people participate in that process and demand equitable outcomes and solutions.
And I'd like to add, beyond advocacy at the federal level of our U.S. representatives and senators, At the local level, and we mentioned some of the barriers to affordable housing around exclusionary zoning. And so we have our councils, our local city councils, and our divisions of planning and development, whatever we call them, Office of Planning and Development. And so we need to make sure that we look at the zoning regs, educate those most impacted around what rights do they currently have. Because they're, someone is discriminating against them and they may not even know what's illegal, what they can't do. And so I like the idea of having tenant associations and bringing in, fair housing lawyers to assist tenant groups in understanding their current rights, but also advocating at the local level for changes in the zoning ordinance that promote development of affordable housing in high opportunity areas. And just thinking strategically about how we use our federal entitlement funds more effectively in our communities, but also municipal bonds, general obligation bonds, and any other grant programs. And how do we bring in corporate, the philanthropic community and government and nonprofits working hand in hand to enhance the quality of life of Memphis and the most, in any city, but I'm going to talk particularly about Memphis, throughout vulnerable communities.
Well, I think Lisa and Roshun have outlined really very well some things that everybody can be a part of. I would also say to, ask candidates that come running for city council or another relevant local position about their stance on these issues, because they rarely ever get questions related to this stuff. And so they kind of skate by and may not even, they may be wanting to help, but it's not raised the way that it should be. Also, for those folks who are landlords or who are close to somebody who is a landlord, and that's a decent number of people out there. Ask them whether they accept housing choice voucher holders. Put their feet to the fire a little bit and let them know that there are folks out there that do care about this issue. In addition to that, we need to all do as much as we can to tell the stories of success of housing choice voucher families, because we need to work on that negative stigma. Of course, we need to change the law and continue to push at every level, but really that stigma is a big problem. And to the extent that we eliminate that one day, I think we're going to have more success with the housing choice voucher program in terms of funding and in terms of access to all different types of neighborhoods and units.
Thank you. That's such an important point of changing the narrative and the stigma around housing choice vouchers. So we are out of time. I mean, I have more questions to ask and we could go on much longer, but we want to honor folks' time. I'm going to turn to Morgan to give us some closing remarks, but I just want to say thank you to Lisa, to Roshun, to Secretary Castro. This has been a wonderful conversation. And if you have not read the report, I encourage you to download it and read it. It's such an important document and gives, as I said, the history, the Memphis study, proposed strategies. And so make sure you download it. Morgan, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Lisa, Cylar, Barrett, and all of your colleagues at the Legal Defense Fund and the Thurgood Marshall Institute for your partnership on this effort. The report details a set of action recommendations, and it's that list that we will move forward with together. In the interest of time, I'll just say we appreciate all of your partnership. Thank you, Secretary Castro. Thank you, Roshun Austin. Lisa Rice, thank you for your leadership. We look forward to everyone's partnership in moving forward on these actions. Thank you. We'll conclude with that and hope you all take care.